Your burger is served. And this is our finest Pepsi Zero Sugar. Its sweet profile perfectly balances the savory notes of your burger.
That is one perfect combination. Burgers deserve Pepsi.
The podcast you're about to hear is true. The names have not been changed to protect the innocent, the guilty, or anyone else. If you're interested in the same type of discussion related to organized crime that you hear in the traditional media, stop listening now. If you're interested in thinking differently or learning something, turn up the volume on your computer, smartphone, or mobile device. This is The Racket Report. Here's Frank Morano.
Welcome to The Racket Report, the podcast that tries to take you inside the world of organized crime from every perspective. And there are a few people that have a keener insight into the world of organized crime than Lou Ferrante. We've talked to a lot of authors before that have written great books about the mob. Lou's certainly done that. We've spoken to people who have been a part of that life as well. Lou has certainly done that. I don't know that I've ever spoken with someone that has an understanding of the mafia and its history on a comprehensive level, going all the way back to Italy, the way Lou Ferrante does. And each time he's been on this program, the response has been absolutely phenomenal. And I am thrilled to welcome back mafia historian, former mob associate, and an author whose latest book is Borgata Clash of Titans, A History of the American Mafia, Volume 2, Lou Ferrante. Lou, it's great to talk to you again.
Thank you so much for having me, Frank, and it's great to speak with you as well. I'm really glad you enjoyed the book.
I loved it, and we're going to get into that in a second. Lou, for people that have not heard our previous conversations, you might take a few people by surprise because you do speak very much like a scholar, but you actually have a pretty colorful history yourself. Without going into too much of the detail that we've covered previously, give folks the Reader's Digest version into your history with the mob.
Sure. Quick nutshell. Started out on the streets, stealing cars, eventually chopping cars, eventually hijacking trucks. In my late teens, I was already a hijacker. I put together a pretty good crew. My early 20s, I was involved with, I guess you could say, I pretty much was in and out of Peter Gotti's house for the better part of 6 or 7 years. Peter Gotti being the brother of John Gotti. I was close with Pete's son. Peter also got close with a lot of other guys. At that time, Joe Butch had a stepson. Jackie D'Amico had a stepson. I became very close with these guys. And at some point or another, the FBI came after me and they charged me with 3 different cases. FBI charged me with a case, rather, Secret Service, another one, and another one by a joint organized crime task force, which was state. I was facing the rest of my life in prison. I hired the civil rights attorney, William Kunstler, at the time. I went through about 6 or 7 attorneys before I represented myself. But before doing that and reversing one of my cases while I was away, I copped out to 13 years to duck a life sentence. And I felt that, I felt 13 years was a good deal. I went to the penitentiary. I served my time in Lewisburg, where I witnessed, I was there for my very first day in population. The Aryan Brotherhood hacked to death and gutted 2 black Muslim inmates. So I was there for a race war. It was a horrible thing to be there for. Maximum security prison is a hell on earth. And it took some time for me to realize that I deserved that. I belonged there because I had done pretty bad things myself. And that was where the wake-up call started to come. And I taught myself how to, I read my first book cover to cover in jail, taught myself how to write, studied law, history, science, anything I get my hands on, I read 18 hours a day. And since I've come home from prison, quite some years now, I've been fortunate enough to publish quite a few books, and this is my latest one, the Borgata Trilogy. Thanks for having me again, Frank.
Oh, yeah, sure thing. It's my pleasure. I think we all know a lot of folks, and so does the public, that get jammed up, they get arrested, they go to prison, and then part of their rehabilitation tour publicly is to claim that they're not the guy they were, that they've got a new lease on life, when in actuality it's just a new scam for them, when they're in actuality trying to get over on the public. For you, that's not the case. I know that, but what can you tell the public about kind of your narrative, which does sound like a lot of these guys who found religion in prison, and then explain why for you it's real, and for a lot of these guys it's just window dressing?
Sure. So we had a saying in jail: if you inform, you never have an opportunity to reform. There's quite a few guys that used to say that, and it's true. And that's not just Italians; that's blacks,
Sure.
Latinos, everybody. We all felt the same, that if you inform, you don't reform, because it's just a revolving door. You get out pretty quickly. You'll probably remember, Frank, when Sammy the Bull Gravano said he was reformed and he was going to teach kids
he
to
ran an ecstasy trafficking ring.
Exactly. So most people who inform just don't have an opportunity to reform. I refused to inform, and not because I had left a life at some point. It was just something that wasn't in me, to rat on my friends and snitch on my friends, people I ate in their houses for dinner. They ate at my house for dinner. They knew my mother and father, my sister. I knew their parents, their children. So it was difficult for me to rat on them. And then with all the time I had on my hands, it was time to reform. And that's when I started to turn my life around inside, so that I would have a new direction and a new avenue and new opportunities when I came home. I just thought that, first of all, I didn't know I would ever come home. So at some point when I was facing life still, I felt like if I serve life, so be it. At least I want to be a better person in here, even in this hell. Maybe I could be better than I am or have been. And knowing then at some point or another, I had 13 years, I felt like, okay, let me start working towards changing my life around as best I can and being prepared for that day when I finally do get out of this hell. And so that it takes time to reform yourself. One is waking up and realizing what you did was wrong. A lot of people, I think they say it, but I don't know if they really realize it, because once I studied law, I helped a lot of other people with their cases. And it was very difficult to get other people to admit that they had done anything wrong. They blame everyone else, and they're innocent, and the government railroaded them. And in many cases that is true, but they also have some responsibility themselves that I would try to talk them into at least recognizing as a first step in changing your life. You got to admit maybe you aren't doing something right. Maybe it's not okay to stick guns in people's mouths, to pistol whip people, to sell drugs, or whatever they were doing. So that was a big deal. When I realized that I had no right to do the things I did, it was a big wake-up call. And then I had to educate myself and be prepared.
You mentioned Peter Gotti. I did an interview with someone last week who was talking about kind of a history of modern mob bosses. And this was not somebody that was in the mob, just somebody that was kind of a scholar of various mob bosses. He said that he would rank Peter Gotti near the bottom of the list in terms of effective mob bosses, in terms of leadership qualities, and it's certainly not really in the same vein as both his brother John and other folks that have been mafia bosses before. As someone that actually knew Peter Gotti, would you agree with that?
No, not at all. I had a lot of respect for Peter, and I would disagree strongly. I don't think that's true. I think that's a lack of understanding about him. John was a very flamboyant guy. He lived a life. He loved a life. Pete was more laid back. Pete wasn't greedy. So he's been sort of like, I guess, categorized as, somebody who kind of was also fell into that position. Pete was a sanitation man, and his brother takes over the family, and he becomes a skipper. And he's there for his brother, but he's loyal to his brother. He's there for his brother. He does what he has to do, but he was never greedy. He was always there for me if I needed something, if I needed anything. I had a lot of respect for him. He was also smart. I think he gets a bum rap where people say he was stupid. He wasn't stupid at all. Maybe the stupid people are the greedy ones. He wasn't greedy. Because he wasn't greedy, maybe he let a few people get away with things, and they say, well, maybe he's stupid. He lets people get away with stuff. That's not the case, that I saw. I brought something to him one day, and I brought somebody to him, and he said, I'll do you the favor. He said, don't worry about it. The guy goes, well, I owe you. He goes, nothing. And I had brought him there to make money, the guy. I wanted to make money. I was bringing him to Pete so that I could make money with Pete. And Pete said afterwards, I said, Pete, I was bringing him here to make money. You told him, he doesn't have to pay. He's not going to want to pay now. How am I going to reverse that? And Pete was like, oh, I didn't want anything. You should have told me before time. He just wasn't a greedy guy. He was laid back.
Wow.
Yeah, and he was sharp. He was sharp too. He just wasn't as loud or flamboyant, as showy as John. He was more laid back. Jeannie, the same thing. I never knew Gene Gotti. Jeannie was away when I started coming around. He just had gone away when I started coming around. So I never really knew Jeannie, but I heard the same thing about Jeannie, laid back, tough, does his whatever then, did his thing. I don't know now. He's home. I heard that then he was a very tough guy. He was very much more laid back than John. But anyway, having said that, yeah, Pete was, to me, he was a good guy. I don't think he ranks above the lowest, like that guy said. I think it's a lack of knowing him or understanding him, and I think whoever that was, I have no idea who said that, but I think if he knew him more, he might have a different opinion about him.
Yeah, well, I'm glad I asked the question. Lastly, in the present day, and then I want to go into the past with your book, there was a big story recently about Joseph Arapello and his son Frank, who were arrested when the NYPD Financial Crimes Task Force carried out a raid on their home. There was headlines all over the New York Post and a bunch of other papers. Columbia family mob boss's son and grandson arrested in New York City ghost gun raid. You read the article and you read that it was not a boss that was their father and grandfather. It was a Colombo family captain, Joseph Tomasello. Do you know anything about these guys or their father and grandfather, Joseph Tomasello?
I don't. I'm very close with the Arenas. I have been close with, I was close with Little Vic Arena, who's away now serving life. And I'm very close with Little Vic Arena Jr., who changed his life around. Talk about somebody who left the life and turned it around. Vic Arena Sr. did. I'm sorry, Jr. So I've been friends with Vic Jr. for about 30 years now. So yes, I've heard the name. I kind of, in passing, I've heard this guy's name. I've probably seen articles, but I don't know him.
Gotcha.
I don't know
okay.
the guy.
Just because it's on a lot of people's mind with this newspaper article, I figured I'd ask you while I have you here. Okay. So we spoke about the first book in your Borgata trilogy, and this has nothing to do with playing poker in Atlantic City or anything like that. Borgata Clash of the Titans, A History of the American Mafia, Volume 2. It sort of picks up where you left off with Volume 1. Set this book up for folks. Why'd you write this book? What time period in Mafia history does it cover?
Yeah, so the first book covered, the first book was the origins of the Mafia, how it started in Sicily and how it sort of was transported over to the United States. And it goes from roughly the 1860s, kind of the unification of Italy, when all the city-states of Italy were brought together. And then it picks up in the United States, and it starts with Prohibition, the stock market crash, and a lot of other rackets, and the creation of the five families in New York, the Mafia's Plymouth Rock in Louisiana, New Orleans specifically, where a lot of the Sicilians and Southern Italians who came to this country, hardworking ones, legitimate ones, gravitated there for work. And it was sort of a climate that they were used to, having a Mediterranean climate, having only been exposed to a Mediterranean climate their whole lives. They felt like the Louisiana atmosphere was a little kinder to them than like the rough snowstorms in New York, where my own grandparents settled. So I pick up in the United States. I go up until 1960, and the mob has pretty much had a free ride for those first 100 years. It's sort of the golden age of the Mafia, which is Volume 1. Volume 2 picks up.
By the way, just set that up for folks if you can. Did they have the free ride because law enforcement wasn't aware of what they were doing, or for some other reason?
Good question, Frank. It was because law enforcement was on the take. And also they corrupted a lot of police and politicians as well. The Mafia had a knack for corrupting people. And it started mostly in Prohibition. They were sort of like, you could literally trace like articles about the mob prior to Prohibition, where they were these vicious people killing each other once in a while in the streets, and they weren't really liked. And they sort of became romantic figures during Prohibition because Americans were desperate for alcohol. They felt like the government were a bunch of hypocrites because senators, congressmen, and even the president had a liquor cabinet, according to Alice Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt's daughter. So, the public wanted alcohol, and the mob was willing to give it to them. They were bootleggers, and they created all these speakeasies, and speakeasies was this place where you had a little password. You could kind of go there, and it was cool. And a lot of women who were chained to domestic chores for like hundreds of years, if not thousands, felt like they could get out now and curse like men, smoke a cigarette or a cigar, drink a glass of alcohol. So they kind of liked the mob. And then after that, the politicians and police, who were all on the take because they didn't feel it was a big deal to be corrupted in light of a law that they didn't agree with either. You got a lot of Irish cops in New York who were going, we're Irish. We like to drink, and we're being told by the government we're not allowed to. So it's tough to tell an Irish cop that, the guy who's going to give you a beer is the bad guy. So and Italians with their wine, the Germans with their beer as well.
Right,
and their
every
alcohol.
culture, really.
Every culture, every ethnicity loves to drink, and they were being denied it. But I only said the Irish because there was a very, very big Irish presence in the police force, and in the NYPD. So a lot of those police and politicians after Prohibition who were dealing with the mob during that time, they were kind of like they still had their hand out. What's the next deal? What do we got going on here? And they had made those inroads already, and now maybe it was a casino, maybe it was an illegal casino, maybe it was infiltration of a union, but they were already dealing with the police and politicians, so they just kept up with them, and so they had a kind of a free ride, and that comes to a screeching halt in Volume 2 when that I should say a completely free ride. No. They had Thomas Dewey that went after them a little. But when Thomas Dewey kind of ran for governor of New York, and then the Republican candidate for president, he kind of moved on. He forgot about the mob. He made a national name for himself. The same thing with Senator S.D. Kefauver. When he had the Kefauver committee, he dragged a lot of mobsters in front of him. He browbeat them in public. He recommended them for charges for deportation. But once he ran for the Democratic nomination for president, he moved on. So he made a name for himself. Well, with the Kennedys, they were pretty sure the Kennedys, who made a name for themselves going after mobsters during the McClellan hearings, which was known as the Rackets Committee. Bobby specifically was a general counsel, and John sat on the committee as well. They went after gangsters across the country, mobsters, and they were promised that once the Kennedys, if you help us get in through Joe Kennedy Sr., who was the patriarch of the family and his liaison with the mob, Frank Sinatra, they pretty much promised the mob bosses around the country, if you help us get into the White House, we're going to look the other way with you guys. Once again, just like everybody else did, we'll move on. There's other issues. There's national issues like civil rights for African Americans. There's international issues like slowing down the nuclear arms race with the Soviets. We're done with the mob. And most of the mob bosses believe that. So they put Jack Kennedy and they helped him get in. They helped him tremendously with the West Virginia primary, dumping money there into the West Virginia primary when Jack Kennedy beat Hubert Humphrey. And then they also helped him win the general election against Richard Nixon in Illinois by swinging a lot of the different wards in Chicago towards Kennedy. And it was one of the narrowest elections in history. So Kennedy pulls it out. The mob feels they're going to be promised something. And Bobby Kennedy is appointed attorney general for the sole reason that Joe Kennedy said that Jack needs to appoint Bobby as AG because he doesn't want people looking into the election and all of the stuff that went on during the election. So he figured with Bobby as AG, any cases will be dismissed. So Bobby's in as AG, and Bobby goes after the mob with a vengeance. And he picked up just where he left off with the Rackets Committee. And the mob is like, what the hell is going on? We trusted this guy. And there were a few mob bosses who did not buy into it. So most of the guys in New York and Chicago bought into the whole Jack Kennedy will be good to us and Bobby will be fine. But now there was Carlos Marcello of Louisiana and Santo Trafficante of Florida. Those are the two mob bosses that did not believe it, did not go along with the rest of them. And they said, we don't trust the Kennedys. We're not going to back them. So they first backed Lyndon Johnson during the primary. When Johnson lost to Kennedy, he was picked as his VP. Then they backed Nixon during the general. And they never trusted the Kennedys. And those are the two premier co-conspirators on the mafia side during the assassination of President Kennedy, which I go deep into in the Borgata Clash of Titans, Volume 2 of the Borgata Trilogy. I really, really show how there's several conspirators. There's three main conspiratorial groups, one being the rogue agents of the CIA who trained the Cuban exiles. And those two groups were very, very close with each other because they felt that Kennedy did not do all he should have done during the Bay of Pigs invasion when the exiles were left on the beaches and then taken captive by Castro. And then they were eventually ransomed and brought back to the States. And then the second time around, he had an opportunity, Kennedy did, during the missile crisis when Soviet nuclear warheads were found 90 miles off the coast of Florida. The Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Cuban exile community, many people in Kennedy's administration wanted him to invade the island. They felt like it was a perfect excuse to get Cuba back. So once again, the exiles felt that Kennedy dropped the ball, did not do all he needed to do. The rogue CIA agents who had trained the exiles really despised Kennedy, felt like his actions were tantamount, or inaction was tantamount to treason. And the mob despised the Kennedys for going after them. And they also wanted Cuba back because they had left all Havana casinos when Castro ejected them. They had left behind all their money and casinos in Havana. So those are the three main conspirators, and I make a very good detailed explanation of how they came together and what their moving parts were in the conspiracy.
Yeah, really interesting. Let me follow up on a few of the things that you said there. So you delve into, as you just alluded to, RFK's war on the mafia. How much of that was personal, and how much was a strategic move against organized crime?
To the best I could gather from all of the research I did, and it's over 10 years of research, 12 to 18 hours a day. I've read every book that you could think of. You've seen, Frank, my notes section in the back.
Oh yeah.
I feel like Jack wasn't the type of guy to hold grudges. He wasn't that type of guy to keep things personal. Joe Kennedy Sr., the patriarch of the family, he said, Bobby's like me. Bobby hates. Bobby holds grudges. Bobby's nasty. Bobby's vengeful. Bobby's like me. Joe would say that. Joe Kennedy said at one point Bobby would have been a great Nazi if he lived during the time of Hitler. He would have really been sincere about it if he was in the Gestapo. So these are things that came from Joe Kennedy, whereas Jack kind of let things roll off his shoulder. He didn't care. But Bobby was the one who held that grudge. He was the one who took everything personal, Bobby did. And Bobby was going to come after the mob with all he had. So when he started coming after them and recommending them for deportation and even deporting some, he deported Carlos Marcello to the jungles of Guatemala, where he had to trek his way through the jungles and make it out of there with broken ribs, barely got home back to Louisiana. And he declared war on Kennedy because of that. And Kennedy was trying to destroy his family, his extended family, meaning his Borgata, and his immediate family, meaning his wife, his children. He was seizing their bank accounts. So these people took it personal. And when the mob went to Joe Kennedy to try to say, hey, look, Joe, they went to Sinatra first and they said, look, go bang on Joe Kennedy's door. Tell him he made us promises and he's got to fulfill these promises. What's going on with his two sons? So literally, Frank Sinatra's in the process of going to Joe Kennedy when Joe Kennedy plays a round of golf down in Palm Beach at the Kennedy estate in Florida, and he suffers a massive stroke after the golf game, and he's done. He's done. He's confined to a wheelchair. Can't communicate, and the boys are on their own. And Gore Vidal, who was a friend of the relative to the Kennedys through marriage, I believe. Gore Vidal, the author, famously said that had Joe been around, he could have straightened out the beef with the mafia in 2 minutes. And that's true. I believe that wholeheartedly, Frank. I think Sinatra, Joe Kennedy would have, if Joe Kennedy told the boys back off, that would have been the end of it. And but Joe Kennedy's now an invalid in a wheelchair, and Sinatra takes a shot at going to Bobby on his own, and Bobby's incensed with this invasion. He feels like it's an invasive. Frank Sinatra has stepped into his domain, and he should not have, and he's livid about it. And then he tells Jack Kennedy, "Look, you can't even be friends with Sinatra anymore. He's connected to mob bosses across the country. You can't have him at the White House anymore. You can't have him at our estate down in Palm Beach or the Hyannis Port, and you can't visit his estate." And that was it. They wrote Sinatra off their guest list on the next White House affair. Yeah. And then the mob had no choice, but they felt like it was kill or be killed.
Meta AI is the personal AI to help you with whatever you need. Plus, it meets you where you are. Not only is Meta AI now an app, but it's also on the apps you already know and love: Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, and Messenger. Plus the Ray-Ban Meta glasses. It's easy to access wherever you are. So whether you're talking or texting, Meta AI is convenient to use throughout your day. Experience our newest AI that's tailored to you by downloading the Meta AI app. Try the Meta AI app today on the Apple App Store and Google Play.
The #1 selling product of its kind with over 20 years of research and innovation. Botox Cosmetic, onabotulinum toxin A, is a prescription medicine used to temporarily make moderate to severe frown lines, crow's feet, and forehead lines look better in adults.
Effects of Botox Cosmetic may spread hours to weeks after injection, causing serious symptoms. Alert your doctor right away as difficulty swallowing, speaking, breathing, eye problems, or muscle weakness may be a sign of a life-threatening condition. Patients with these conditions before injection are at highest risk. Don't receive Botox Cosmetic if you have a skin infection. Side effects may include allergic reactions, injection site pain, headache, eyebrow and eyelid drooping, and eyelid swelling. Allergic reactions can include rash, welts, asthma symptoms, and dizziness. Tell your doctor about medical history, muscle or nerve conditions including ALS or Lou Gehrig's disease, myasthenia gravis, or Lambert-Eaton syndrome and medications, including botulinum toxins, as these may increase the risk of serious side effects. For full safety information, visit BotoxCosmetic.com or call 877-351-0300.
See for yourself at BotoxCosmetic.com.
PMS, pregnancy, menopause. Being a woman is a lot. Ollie supports you and yours with expert solutions for every age and life stage. They just launched 2 new products exclusively at Walmart. Period Hero combats bloat, mood swings, and more during PMS. And Balance Perimeno to support hormonal balance, mood, and metabolism during perimenopause. Grab yours at Ollie.com. Ollie! These statements have not been evaluated by the Food and Drug Administration. This product is not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease.
Did you know that parents rank financial literacy as the #1 most difficult life skill to teach? Meet Greenlight, the debit card and money app for families. With Greenlight, you can send money to kids quickly, set up chores, automate allowance, and keep an eye on your kids' spending with real-time notifications. Kids learn to earn, save, and spend wisely, and parents can rest easy knowing their kids are learning about money with guardrails in place. Try Greenlight risk-free today at greenlight.com/Spotify.
All right, so let's talk about the kill or be killed aspect of this. You described the mafia's response to the Kennedys, particularly Carlos Marcello and Santo Trafficante. How organized was their effort against JFK? And do you believe the mob played a more significant role in the assassination than is generally accepted?
I believe they played, just to answer the first part first, the second part first, rather. I believe that there was they played the ground role. Marcello was floating around the idea that he was offering $1 million when Kennedy comes down south to anybody who wants a contract. And Marcello was estimated to rake in over $1 billion a year in his rackets, over $1 billion. And he had all the politicians in his pocket in Louisiana and Texas, including Lyndon Johnson, the vice president. He underwrote his congressional and senatorial campaigns. And in return, Johnson would kill in committee any type of anti-gambling rackets, any legislature rather, that would hurt Marcello's empire. So there was they had a symbiotic relationship, Johnson and Marcello. So the mob did play a bigger role in the sense that they did have the ground game. I believe that the mob was crucial in one instance, and this was the operational part, the first part of your question. How did they orchestrate it, et cetera? If I remembered your question correctly, they, not specifically Marcello and Trafficante, who were prime movers and prime underwriters of the assassination, but they had a guy named David Ferry, who I refer to as the mafia's Clausewitz. And David Ferry was a guy, interesting character. And he was a guy who really he was very close with the Cuban exiles and worked with the CIA. And he was considered the master of intrigue, quote unquote, the master of intrigue. That's what they referred to him. And he loved weaving these intricate intrigues. And I believe there's a lot of evidence. First of all, he was very close with Marcello, and he was pushed together with Marcello because when Marcello had these phony cases, now Marcello was a criminal, obviously, but Bobby had fraudulent cases brought against him with regard to the deportation order. Marcello had a forged birth certificate from Guatemala. Bobby knew it to be forged. He knew it was forged, and he deported him anyway, knowing it was forged, which means Bobby doubled down and committed his own crime. So at that point, Carlos Marcello returns to the States, and he's now indicted. Bobby doubled down yet again and indicted him for illegal reentry, for having the audacity to come back to the States. And Marcello hires a private investigator by the name of David Ferry, and they become very close. And the 2 weekends leading up to the assassination, Marcello is shacked up in one of his bayou retreats alone with David Ferry for the entire weekend. What are these two men doing together? Well, they later said to the FBI, Ferry did, hey, we were just discussing trial strategy for Marcello's upcoming strategy, but there were upcoming trial, but there were no defense attorneys there, no communication with defense attorneys. It's very, very hard to believe, and I go through the list of reasons why. So what happens, just so you know why the mafia needed to underwrite not only the Cuban exiles, but the conspiracy. When after the missile crisis, Kennedy made a side deal with Khrushchev. Not only Khrushchev was going to pull the missiles out of Cuba, which was great, but we didn't find out for 2 decades later that Kennedy made also a side deal with Khrushchev, the premier of the Soviet Union, Nikita Khrushchev. He made a side deal with him that he would take out the missiles, the U.S. missiles in Turkey, pointing at the Soviet Union, which, by the way, incensed the heads of NATO, going, what are you doing? You need to confront the issue. At first, they changed their minds later because it was proper to do that. But at first, they wanted Kennedy to attack Cuba, and they did not want this quid pro quo where you take out the missiles in Turkey, which would make them weaker in Western Europe. Mm-hmm. They were terrified of the Soviets, running past, flexing their muscle and running past the Iron Curtain. Mm-hmm. So that said, Kennedy also tells Khrushchev, I promise you, we will not ever try to invade or back an invasion of Cuba ever again. And now he defunds the exiles, and he basically says to Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy, lock them up if they continue to any sabotage missions into Cuba, treat them as if they're criminals. And now they're being locked up all over the place. These same people who were the mascots of liberty since Castro ousted Fulgencio Batista, these same mascots of liberty who were living in the United States, desperate to take their homeland back in the name of democracy, are now criminals of the Kennedy administration. So they needed somebody to underwrite them. And they turned to Marcello and Trafficante, who began underwriting not only anything they were doing, but also the training camps in Louisiana and Miami. There were training camps near Lake Pontchartrain in Louisiana, where David Ferry and Lee Harvey Oswald, the alleged assassin of John F. Kennedy, were seen together often at these training camps. And these were funded by Marcello. So Marcello and Trafficante are underwriting the Cuban exiles, underwriting the rogue CIA agents because they can't get money for the Cuban exiles anymore. And I believe that they put the pieces on the ground together. Now, they could never have done it, the mob, without the help of the CIA. And I make a very, very clear argument for it at the end of the book, Frank, as I'm sure you've seen, the Secret Service. There are a number of changes that the Secret Service, and they've been overlooked, Frank, until now. This is the first time the first time, and I've read hundreds of books on the subject.
Right, me too.
Where they tiptoe around the Secret Service, and I'm going, oh my gosh, the Secret Service are the culprits. In the end, somebody had gotten to them. We don't know who, but just to give you a quick idea of all the things the Secret Service did that are mysterious. They removed the bubble top from Kennedy's limousine after he lands at Love Field. Okay, the sun's out. Okay, partially excusable, maybe. They removed the bubble top though, so there's no longer an obstruction for a shooter. Then there are two agents that would normally sit on the back hood, the trunk of the car, the lid, and there would be two steps welded under the bumper on the left, beneath the left and right rear taillights. And there's a sort of like a bar you would hold on to if you can imagine a roller coaster. It's like a steel ball welded into the trunk. Those two agents that ride, very big agents, by the way, they're tall, over 6 feet. Those two agents who ride the back were told, we don't want you on the back of the limousine by the Secret Service. So they're totally confounded, going, why aren't we riding the back of the limousine? Then there was 8 motorcycle cops positioned around Kennedy's limousine in the motorcade. They tell 4, we're bumping you to the back, without an explanation. So now there's only 4 motorcycle cops instead of 8 surrounding the limousine. These guys don't understand what's going on. So now they said the detail, if you notice when you see the Zapruder film, there's not too much of a crowd by time when Kennedy makes, by the way, first, before I get to the crowd, there's a last minute change for the motorcade to turn a hairpin turn onto Elm Street. That brings the limousine down to a slow crawl amidst a canyon of buildings. Why is Kennedy being told by the Secret Service? Kennedy could have went straight, got on the Stemmons Freeway. He's making this unnecessary turn that's bringing the limousine down to a crawl. That Jacqueline Kennedy later said, we didn't want that. Evelyn Lincoln, President Kennedy's secretary, said, we didn't want that. We didn't understand why they were doing that. And you're placing Kennedy amidst a canyon of buildings. Those buildings weren't pre-secured by the Secret Service. And now, if you've watched the Zapruder film, you notice that it's not too crowded by the grassy knoll. There's people scattered, but nothing compared to the crowds that Kennedy was experiencing from Love Field until Elm Street. Downtown Dallas was packed. And all of a sudden, because the police detail ended before there, the Secret Service detail, the police detail, you don't have people. All you have is the shooters in the kill zone. So that's another thing. So all of these things are done by the Secret Service. So at one point, one of the Secret Service agents says, I don't understand all these changes. Call Washington. So they call Washington, and a man by the name of Winston Lawson was the guy on the ground. So just to give you how the Secret Service operated, Forrest Searles is the Secret Service agent in charge of the Dallas area for many, many years. He's the Secret Service guy from Dallas. Winston Lawson is the guy who comes in before the assassination, about 10 or 12 days out, to start preparing for the motorcade. So Winston Lawson is the Washington guy who's going to be working hand in hand with Forrest Searles. So if Winston Lawson is dictating all these commands, nobody believes it. Nobody can believe that. The press vehicle, too, one more thing. Press vehicle, which is normally a couple of cars behind Kennedy, was bumped to the way to the back of the line. All the journalists are going, why were we bumped? Well, maybe because they know how to snap pictures, Frank. You know, this was odd, too. Nobody could figure it out. So they call Washington. And they go get somebody on the line. Well, they talk to Gerald Bain. Gerald Bain was with Kennedy from the day Kennedy was elected. Gerald Bain never missed a motorcade, and he always sat directly in front of President Kennedy in the right front passenger seat, always directly in front of Kennedy. Well, Gerald Bain, during Kennedy's most dangerous upcoming trip, which was to Dallas, everybody feared that Adelaide Stevenson was beat up when he went to Dallas. Everybody was warning Kennedy, we don't know if we could trust everybody in Dallas. It's a little bit of there were a number of extremists there. We fear, don't go. People were telling them. So the Secret Service, it's crucial that they're in Dallas with him. Gerald Bain, who never left Kennedy's side, suddenly decides to take a vacation before Dallas. So he's supposed to be on vacation. When they call Washington to ask, hey, what's going on with all these last-minute changes to the motorcade route, Gerald Bain answers the phone and says, oh, don't worry, just do what I said, and don't crowd the agents too much. I'm sorry, don't crowd Kennedy. Tell the agents not to crowd him too much. We don't want too many agents around Kennedy. He wants to be seen by the crowd. So they hang up and they go, hey, I thought Gerald Bain, another agent says to the agent who called, hey, I thought Gerald Bain was on vacation. Yeah, he said he decided at the last minute to come back, and after he thought he was going to take a vacation, he decided to work, and he's working out of the East Wing throughout the motorcade. A little strange, Frank. A little strange. A little's not the word. Exactly, Frank. So, and I'm the first person, after decades of this, I'm the first person who put that all together. And I'm going to tell you something else, Frank. I'm not sure, you could love or hate Trump. Your listeners could love or hate Trump. Doesn't matter to me. But leading up to the assassination attempts on Trump, I was scratching my head because I had completed this volume already. And I know what the Secret Service did with Kennedy. And I'm going, gee, if anything happens with Trump, no, I look at the Secret Service guys in Washington, not the guys on the ground and the women on the ground. The men and women on the ground are not in the loop. They put their lives on the line. I believe that they're wholehearted, sincere, patriotic Americans, and they put their lives on the line. They're willing to jump in front of a bullet for the president, and they did a great job. But I did say, watch those Secret Service people in Washington. It's a little nerve-wracking for me, having read that and written it, all those different pieces and putting them together and putting them at the end of my book. I'm saying if it comes, I bet you we're going to be scratching our heads going, what happened with the Secret Service? And even though there were attempts and they were not seen through, a lot of people have scratched their heads and go, well, I think the Secret Service may have dropped the ball here. I'm not saying that they're guilty of anything with President Trump. I don't know. Or back then it was candidate Trump. I have no idea, Frank. I'm not accusing anybody. I don't want to be misconstrued. I'm just saying that the mob is somehow involved on the ground. There were rogue CIA agents somehow involved, but nobody has ever given a real sharp finger and pointed it at the Secret Service for Kennedy. And somebody made all of those last-minute changes to the motorcade route. And without those changes, Kennedy would be alive. And that strikes me as really, really strange.
Wow. Speaking of law enforcement and the complicity or willful negligence on the part of law enforcement when it comes to the mob, J. Edgar Hoover, who we haven't really discussed yet, seemed reluctant to go after the mob until RFK forced his hand. Was Hoover compromised? Was he indifferent? Or was he just being politically pragmatic when it came to dealing with the mob?
Yeah, he's a crucial figure. And I'm really glad you asked that, because it's something that everybody wonders about. Was he in the pocket of the mob? And there are a lot of books that have been written where there's hearsay that say the mob had pictures of him in compromising positions with his assistant director, Clyde Tolson. They were believed to have been a couple. A lot of people in Washington believe that Hoover and Tolson were a couple. There's no real evidence of that. There's a lot of circumstantial evidence to suggest that before being gay in America is fine now. For the most part, everybody in America has no problem with homosexuality, but we're talking about the 1960s. And, homosexuals, gays had to hide. They had to hide, and they were in a closet. And you have to look back at that era and say, okay, if Hoover was gay and Tolson was gay, they would have gone out of their way to hide it. And I do not believe they were compromised in any way like that. There's no evidence to suggest that that's real. It's all been hearsay. Some of it, because I always look for the original source of where this may have come from. And a lot of it started with people who were sort of like, didn't like Hoover and mentioned it at a party to somebody, and then that person mentioned it to another person, and then it ends up in print, and then it ends up in maybe an article, then a book, and so on. But there's no real evidence. So the best that I could gather, why Hoover and Hoover did not want to tackle the mob, and he looked the other way. And I made a really strong argument for this in my book. Hoover believed that his job was to confront threats to America, to the United States as a country, domestic or international security, and also to our institutions. The mafia was never a real threat. They liked democracy because they're able to play with it. They're able to buy politicians. They're able to play around with the ballot box. They're able to underwrite campaigns. Carlos Marcello, for example, would underwrite both gubernatorial candidates in Louisiana. He would pay for both solely at times. He would pay for both campaigns. So it didn't matter to him who won. Either one was going to do everything he wanted. Wow. So he didn't care. Yeah, so he loves democracy. He loves capitalism. So the Hoover didn't see them as a threat to American institutions. They also, plenty of mobsters have fought. They go to war. They put on a uniform. There were plenty of mobsters who fought in World War II. They helped with U.S. naval intelligence, as I write about in Volume 1 of the Borgata Trilogy, Rise of Empire. They helped with naval intelligence to secure the Eastern Seaboard, make sure that there were no Nazi sabotage missions. There were no U-boats cruising off the coast. And they helped naval intelligence. They're patriotic Americans. So Hoover didn't feel they were a threat to America or its institutions, whereas Hoover focused a lot of attention on communists. He believed the communist threat was real. Anti-war protesters. He did not like people interfering with international policy. If the Congress and the president decides to go to war, he didn't want a bunch of hippies maybe with signs and placards, trying to reverse that decision. So these are the people that Hoover specifically focused on. But also, here's a crucial piece of the puzzle, Frank. When Hoover set up all of these illegal eavesdropping devices across the country, and he had his agents go in and plant them in the middle of the night, and they were called black bag jobs. And when his agents would plant these eavesdropping devices, and Hoover would start getting the transcripts past his desk, he saw that whether it's Chicago, New York, Kansas City, Los Angeles, they're talking about the mayors they got in their pocket, the governors, the congressmen, the senators, judges. Frank Costello famously was appointing judges in New York. He had Tammany Hall in his pocket. Mafia boss Frank Costello. He's got Tammany Hall in his pocket, and he's overheard on, this is before Hoover's eavesdropping devices. This is by Frank Hogan, who was the prosecutor in New York. Frank Hogan bugs Costello's phone, and he gets a phone call from a Supreme Court justice saying, "Hey, Frank, thanks for the appointment. I appreciate the appointment." And Frank Costello says, "Well, I told you it would go down smooth, no problem." He's appointing judges. He's the boss of the mafia, an acting boss, but the boss. So Hoover now sees this on a larger scale throughout the country, and Hoover wants to know why the hell Bobby wants to shake this tree. Does Bobby expect Hoover to surround the Capitol Rotunda and tell everybody to come out with their hands up? I mean, what does Bobby expect? And does Bobby want Hoover to do a deep dive into the origins of the Kennedy fortune and see that Joe Kennedy was in bed with bootleggers, that Joe Kennedy was with the mob as far as labor relations with his Hollywood company that made B-rate movies? Is that what Bobby wants? And Hoover's like shrugging his shoulders going, a deep dive into the mafia and a forensic accounting of their money leads one place, and it's called Washington, D.C. And when Bobby would have hearings, on whether it be on the McClellan Committee hearings or as Attorney General, when he was doing investigations, time and time again, his father's name would pop up, and the underlings at the Justice Department, or when he was chief counsel, would say he would be distraught the rest of the day. He didn't know how to handle it because a lot of the investigations went back to his father. At one point, Bobby was attacking the Teamsters and their infiltration, having been infiltrated by the mob. The mob controlled the Teamsters across the country, the locals. So Bobby's trying to find out where the Teamsters are headquartered in New York, and he finds out that one of the biggest buildings they're headquartered in, the landlord is Joe Kennedy Sr.
Wow. And
Bobby doesn't know how to react to that. So, Hoover was scratching his head going, look, I'm here to protect the United States. There's a character, Frank, on Game of Thrones who famously said in like one of his scenes, he said, look, I don't care who the emperor, the king is. I care about the realm. And I think that's what type of person Hoover was. He cared about the realm. The president didn't matter to him. He sat through countless presidents in the decades he was there. All the presidents that came and went while Hoover was there. Hoover didn't care if it's Johnson, Kennedy, Ford, not Ford, but before Ford. Hoover was dead in the early 70s. Nixon, he died when Nixon was president. So he didn't care, Hoover, who the president was. It didn't matter to him. It mattered if he preserved the United States as a country, as a nation. And the mob was not a threat to the United States. And he knew that a deep dive into the mob was a deep dive into Washington corruption.
All right, let's talk a little bit about the internal mafia politics and some of the power struggles that are going on there. The Profaci-Gallo War is one of the most famous internal mafia conflicts. What made the Gallos unique among mobsters, and how close did they really come to reshaping the balance of power?
Yeah, so I made a connection with the Gallos that I have not seen yet in any of the books I had read and any material out there, and this is years of research. I believe the Gallos, when they went before the McClellan Committee, the Rackets Committee, Bobby had dragged Joey and Larry Gallo in front of the Rackets Committee, and he browbeat them. They took the Fifth Amendment, I think 48 times. Joey took it, Larry maybe more. Whatever it was, they came home, and this was nationally televised. And they came home from the Rackets Committee in Washington, where mostly Bobby was subpoenaing big mob bosses and big mob chieftains. And all of a sudden, these two Gallos, who were low-level guys, they were soldiers for the Profaci Borgata, which would eventually become the Colombo family. So they're low-level guys with the Profaci Borgata. And then all of a sudden, they're dragged to Washington, and they're up there with the biggest bosses being browbeat by Bobby. And they come home with a big reputation. And I think it filled their head, Frank. I really feel like they went back to Red Hook, Brooklyn as superstars. And everybody's looking at them. Everybody watched them on TV, and everybody's kind of sucking up to them now. And wow, there's Joey and Larry Gallo. They were in Washington. Because something happened to pump up their head and make them think that they could overthrow the Borgata from the bottom. Once in a while you have in history, most coups take place at the top. Once in a while, there's a junior officer coup. I think like Muammar Gaddafi was one of the ones who led a junior officer coup. There's a few that happened in Latin America, a few like that in North Africa. These happened throughout history. They're not common. But these were low-level guys, Larry and Joey. And all of a sudden, they're making a move on Profaci, and they want to take over the Borgata. I can only connect that to they're coming back from Washington with their heads pumped up. So they kidnap a few guys. And I think if they either if they were able to kidnap Profaci, which they wanted, they may have killed them all. Or it was sort of like, there's also a theory that I read, and I've talked to some Colombo guys and old timers who were around back then, but even they don't have the exact story, like what they thought they were going to get out of kidnapping these 4 or 5 guys from the Profaci Borgata. And when they didn't get Profaci, a war breaks out. So at some point or another, Larry's he's hard pressed to either kill the hostages or let them go and see if he could work a deal with Profaci. He wants more of the rackets, more of the spoils. And Profaci basically was an old time Italian, nice and patient. I got old time Italian relatives from the other side. They could watch a tomato grow. Whereas, as an Italian American myself, I'm in a rush to get the tomato from the store and make my sandwich, where they could just sit and watch it grow for months. This is like the old time, and Profaci was like that. So Profaci wears them down, and he eventually gets them to release the hostages. And then he kind of he's got a huge war chest, and he declares war. So the Gallos go to the mattresses, and they have like a diverse crew of guys who really can't get made. They can't get straightened out. They're tough guys. You got Pete the Greek, you got an Egyptian, you got 2 Syrians, you got a dwarf, And a lot of these guys, they were tough guys, they were loyal guys, but at some point or another, what are they fighting for? They're never going to get straightened out in the Profaci Borgata. At best, they're going to have Larry and Joey up there, which is good for them. But Profaci's got all these buttons, and he's got all these soldiers that are ready to kill for him. So it's a little lopsided. At some point or another, Joey goes away for a case. He butchered a case. They were desperate for money. They were trying to make money. It was tough to make money when you're at war, whereas Profaci had a lot of money backing him up from the beginning, so Profaci could last a lot longer. I remember I read one day, I don't know if it was when I think it was when the United States Civil War broke out. Somebody asked one of the Rothschilds who will win, and they said whoever has more money. If the North has more money, it doesn't matter how long, whatever. The North will win. And I think they famously said also the Rothschilds is money is the sinews of war. And that's basically how Profaci was able to win. He wore them down. But at some point, Profaci drops dead and the hostilities start up again. And, it's back and forth until at some point or another, Joe Colombo is placed in there and by Carlo Gambino. People in the Colombo family don't like to admit that, but that's exactly what happened. Carlo Gambino was sort of a bit of a puppeteer at the time. And he had a little control over the Borgata, and he put Joe Colombo in there, and then he did like a little bit of a mini Marshall Plan because the war-torn Borgata was broke, and Carlo Gambino gave Joe Colombo money to push out on the street so that he could start putting things together again. So it was definitely like the first time in 30 years since the commission was formed in the 1930s that somebody had challenged one of the old-time dons from the bottom especially. So it's a really, really interesting part of the book.
Hey, it's Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. Now, I was looking for fun ways to tell you that Mint's offer of unlimited premium wireless for $15 a month is back. So I thought it would be fun if we made $15 bills. But it turns out that's very illegal. So there goes my big idea for the commercial. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. New customer offer for first 3 months only. Speed slow after 35 gigabytes if network's busy. Taxes and fees extra. See mintmobile.com.
So good, so good, so good.
Great brands, great prices. Everyone's got a reason to rack.
You know they have Marc Jacobs?
Nike? Yes.
Just so many good brands.
Vince, Birkenstock, and more brands you love are at Nordstrom Rack stores now. Plus, buy it online and pick it up in-store the same day for free. Great brands, great prices. That's why you rack.
At Arizona State University, we're bringing world-class education from our globally acclaimed faculty to you. Ranked #1 in innovation for 10 consecutive years and #2 among public universities for employability. ASU isn't just ahead of the curve, it's creating new paths to success. Earn your degree from the nation's most innovative university. Online, that's a degree better. Explore more than 300 undergraduate, graduate, and certificate programs at asuonline.asu.edu.
We interrupt this program to bring you an important Wayfair message. Wayfair's got style tips for every home. This is Styles McKenzie helping you make those rooms sing. Today's style tip. When it comes to making a statement, treat bold patterns like neutrals. Go wild, like an untamed animal print area rug under a rustic farmhouse table from Wayfair.com. Arr, fierce. This has been your Wayfair style tip to keep those interiors superior.
Wayfair, every style, every home.
You talk about Joe Colombo. Let me ask you about another Joe that's the namesake of another modern mafia family, Joe Bonanno, and what his relationship was with the commission. Where Joe Bonanno was one of the few people to be a mob boss and genuinely retire without ending up dead or in prison or an informant. Where does Joe Bonanno come into all this?
Joe Bonanno comes in where it's the first real civil war that a mafia family has. Guys have gotten whacked. Albert and Anastasia clipped the Mangano brothers and took over. Carlo Gambino was part of the cabal that killed Albert Anastasia. So guys are getting clipped within their own family, and this is happening. Okay, fine, that's understood, but there's never been a real civil war. And Joe Bonanno, just as Profaci was the first mafia rebellion from the bottom, Profaci's family, Joe Bonanno's family was the first civil war. And that happens when Joe Bonanno gets on the wrong side with the commission. the commission was sort of like pushing their weight around. He felt like when Profaci died, he didn't have any allies on the commission. Him and Joe Profaci were allies, whereas Gambino, Lucchese, and Genovese were sort of the second block of guys that formed an alliance. So it's usually 3-2, these decisions in New York. And Bonanno felt like he was pushed aside and he wasn't winning decisions, and he felt like he had to make a move. So there's some evidence to say that he was part of it, some evidence to say that he wasn't, but apparently Joe Magliocco, who was Profaci's replacement, makes a move to kill Gambino and Lucchese. And it's going to be a double homicide. He's going to get rid of them. Well, the plot was exposed by Joe Colombo, who ran to Gambino and then was rewarded by, ended up running the Borgata. But that was crucial to Bonanno too, because Bonanno was implicated in that plot. And once Bonanno's implicated in that plot, Gambino's very unforgiving. And he's got it in for him. So at some point or another, there's other reasons that Bonanno runs to between that and also to the law. He's got a lot of pressure from the law, a lot of heat. He runs to Canada, and at some point he comes back and he fakes his own abduction, which was really interesting. Bonanno does. So while he's away and he's hiding out, he made a crucial mistake. So the family is split, and they're trying to get Bonanno to come before the commission. He doesn't trust Gambino. And this is even before Lucchese died. He doesn't trust Gambino or Lucchese. Didn't like either one of them. But after Lucchese's dead, he still doesn't trust Gambino, and he won't come before the commission. He refuses to. He feels like it's a setup. And but he makes a crucial mistake. The family's kind of still hanging tough with Bonanno. They can't split them. They're trying desperately to split them up. Guys are really, really working at it, trying to split up the Bonannos. But they're loyal to Joe Bonanno. But at some point, Joe Bonanno appoints his inexperienced son, Bill Bonanno, as the family consigliere. When he does that, it's a crucial mistake, because a consigliere is supposed to advise a boss. So how does a son advise a father? I know for a fact my own father, if I tried to tell my father, even if I was right, and I tried to tell my father something to do, my father would say, "Shut up, Chooch. What do you know?" So, like, this is like, so, Ujuch, he would say. So this is like, this is looked at now going, how in hell does he appoint his son consigliere? Now, Trafficante, let's just take just a split second as an aside. When Santo Trafficante, when his father was grooming him to be the boss of the Florida Borgata, based originally out of Tampa, eventually out of Miami, when his father was grooming him, what his father did was he stepped aside, made his son Santo the boss, and he became the consigliere. This way, nobody could criticize him. He said, "Look, I got a lot of experience. I'm advising my son." So nobody could say, "Oh, well, it makes sense." Well, Bonanno failed to do that. Maybe his ego, whatever it was, Bonanno refused to step aside, but he appoints his son as a consigliere, and everybody's scratching their head going, how does a son advise a father? So now the family splits. And then you have the Bonanno War. And, he was supposed to appoint somebody else who was a long-time Gumbata of his, a guy from originally came from Castellamare del Golfo with him. And this guy wasn't appointed, and that guy was mad. He was bitter about it. And he had a little bit of a faction with him. And the Bonannos split up, and they never really put it together again, for a long time, until Rusty Rastelli. And then eventually Rusty, and then Joe Massino, who became eventually an informant. But the Bonannos were war-torn. And I go through that deeply in Volume 2 of the Borgata Trilogy. They were a war-torn family for quite some time. But Bonanno was smart enough, as you said, from the question, he was smart enough to step aside. Most aren't. Most go until they're killed or don't. Look at people in power. I mean, you got Feinstein, who was a Democrat. She had to be wheeled out of Congress, and you just had McConnell, who's a Republican. So it doesn't matter what party. These people don't leave. Right. They're falling over and rolling down the aisle. They don't want to leave. Nobody wants to give up power.
Before we run out of time here, I got to ask you about Joe Valachi. You mentioned Sammy Gravano. Joe Valachi was the Gravano of his day, one of the first big mafia turncoats, especially to testify in such a high-profile manner. His testimony was a seismic event. Did his betrayal do as much damage to the mafia as law enforcement claimed, or was it something that was more symbolic than substantial?
It was symbolic. There was no real indictments that stemmed from the Valachi hearings. It was very symbolic. It was a way to finally present to the American public that this really does exist, and here's a live witness that will tell you from his own mouth that it exists. Short of that, Genovese didn't have any problems. He was already in jail. The other bosses, Valachi never met. He was low level. But, he's the guy who defines it now. He says, look, there's this thing, La Cosa Nostra, we call it. It's our thing. It comes from Sicily, but now they let other guys in like me. I'm a Napolitan or Neapolitan. So they let other guys in, Calabrians they let in, the Calabrese. So now this is where it's all for the first time projected to the American public. This exists. You saw Appalachian. You saw them running into the woods, but nobody talked. Now we got Valachi, a live witness. We're going to put him on the stand and show you. And Bobby loved it. Bobby ate it up, Bobby Kennedy, who was still there at the time. What I was able to debunk with regard to Valachi was you read these books and he says Valachi killed a guy who he thought was Joe Beck di Palermo, and because he thought his own life was in danger, and he pipes Joe Beck over the head, then finds out it's not Joe Beck. That's all BS. Joe Valachi knew exactly what he was doing. He looked around the yard for the weakest lamb in the herd, and he piped over the head some white collar forger just to get put into protective custody, and then he became a snitch. And they couldn't say that. They couldn't say that our cherished witness piped to death an innocent man. But you need to listen to him. They had to say, well, he was defending his life. He thought it was Joe Beck di Palermo. But I make a clear case that's not what happened. I did a lot of hard time. Frank, I did time in the pen. You don't mistake one guy for another. You know every face in that place. I knew every face, every ethnicity, every inmate, and every guard. To the degree, Frank, where if I was walking the yard, let's say with Jimmy Coonan, and another guy walked in, I'd say, hey, Jimmy, who's this guy? And Jimmy would say, I don't know, I never saw him before. There's 1,200 guys in there, and we spot that guy right away. So you know everybody. There's no way Joe Valachi accidentally piped over this guy and mistook him for a guy he knew his whole life. Joe Beck di Palermo was a guy he dealt with for decades. You know if it's Joe Beck or not. So that was all. But anyway, that's what I was able to uncover with regard to Valachi. But he was more symbolic, just as you said.
All right, last question, and then I hope we can chat again soon. In your research, you cover a lot of time here, a lot of different mafia bosses, a lot of different personality types. Looking at the period covered in Borgata Volume 2, who was the most underrated mob boss in terms of both influence and power? Maybe you could say criminally underrated.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's a really easy question for me. I feel like Carlos Marcello, not only did he have $1 billion, and this is by a gentleman who was in charge of the criminal law enforcement agency in Louisiana and couldn't figure out why the FBI was ignoring him. Not only did he have over $1 billion in revenue coming in all to himself, not like the New York families who have to split it 5 ways, all to himself, but not only that, but also very low key, had all of the state machinery in his pocket. When an FBI agent years later in 1978 during the House Assassinations Committee, the FBI agent from Louisiana was asked, tell us about Carlos Marcello. He said, what do you want to know about him? He's a tomato salesman. I mean, up until then, he's thought of as a tomato salesman. And the reason why he was thought of as a tomato salesman is because he owned a tomato canning company, and one of his chief clients was the United States Navy, by the way. So, I mean, this was an incredible guy. And not only did he have all of that, but he also was, and I wholeheartedly believe it, the main conspirator on the ground with regard to President Kennedy's death.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah.
Hey,
yeah,
I'm going to have to end it there, Lou. I really appreciate the time. I hope everybody checks out the book. It's Borgata Clash of Titans, A History of the American Mafia, Volume 2. It's available on Amazon or wherever else you get your books. But if you haven't checked out the first book in this Borgata trilogy, I definitely suggest people check it out. Just go to Amazon, type Lou Ferrante, Ferrante, or just type Borgata Clash of the Titans. It comes right up, or Clash of Titans. Lou, thank you as always. It's always a treat.
Thank you so much for having me, Frank.
If you enjoyed this podcast, please do us a favor and share it on social media. Pass it on to a friend. If somebody sent this to you, do us a favor and subscribe. You can subscribe for free at any podcast app. Just search The Racket Report or just go to WABCRadio.com and search The Racket Report. Comes right up. Until the next time we meet in cyberspace, I'll see you on the radio.